Yeah, I have the same understanding that most of the manufacturers are using the same components if the models are about same
Hmm.
from same year or
Yep.
range, it shouldn't be a big difference. And yeah, there's usually noise in one channel more than others, and then it
Yeah.
depends which way it's been arranged. And of course, if you use it on the wrist, it's different than on the thigh. So yeah,
Yep.
I think those should be probably communicated better from manufacturers, that the researchers would understand which way is the
Hmm.
best to wear. And you mentioned Actigraph, and I noticed you have done some papers about cross generational comparability of
Hmm.
Actigraph models. Maybe shortly, how were the results?
Yeah, so it's the reliable. I've had a lot of fun with the reliability studies because you have to, they're deceptively difficult to do. You know, on the one hand, you would think, oh, it's fairly easy. Okay, we have to think about a few different aspects of reliability. If the one person does the exact same activity twice, will a single device tell you the same thing?
Hmm.
Or if you have two of the same monitor in the same body location and a person does an activity, will it tell you the same thing? So the first one's intra-monitor reliability or test-retest reliability. The second one would be between monitor reliability or inter-monitor reliability. So you have to set up ways to try to capture both of those constructs. And so the best that we've been able to do, so for the inter-monitor reliability, we get some really, really good sticky tape and we tape two monitors together. And
Hmm.
so whether you're wearing up the hip or the wrist, you're essentially stacking monitors on top of each other
Hmm.
so that when you move, at least the magnitude of movement should be extremely similar. And the device orientation, as close as you can get it with the tape, is going to be similar. But even small variations will affect the data, right? I mean, if we're
Hmm.
1% off in our orientation, there's going to be some error that's detected or noticed in our statistical analysis that's really just we couldn't perfectly place the devices next to each other. Or when you stack devices, you do have an outer device, and so one of them is going to move slightly more than the other, right?
Hmm.
Just from a physics, you have a longer lever arm, and so that changes things just a little
Hmm.
bit.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to perfectly get these devices so that we can do things like cross generational testing and stuff, although you do the best you can, right? And
Hmm.
you accept that even the best methodological approach will have some at least minor degree of error. So I guess that's just a backdrop, right? When we're doing these studies, we can't quite perfectly do it, even in the shaker table, right? I mean, you try to set the device orientation exactly the same, and you cushion them in the same way, and there's going to be slight or subtle variations probably in
Hmm.
those types of analyses. I think the end story is that between devices, so if you're looking between devices of even of the same generation, so two actigraph link monitors placed one on top of the other, you will see subtle differences in the both the raw acceleration signal as well as if you were to convert to something like activity counts. Now, I couldn't tell you the percentages offhand. I mean, it's single digit percentage differences. It's probably
Hmm.
2 to 5%
Hmm.
different, and that's not insignificant in some cases. But what happens is when you try to, so that's like the raw signal, right? Or
Hmm.
minute level data, whatever, some short epoch duration. When you collapse that across a day and look at total calories burned or total moderate to vigorous activity, I don't think we've seen very many cases in which those differences appear meaningful. So
Hmm.
any subtle differences at the short, micro level kind of wash out over the course of a day. And so within a certain device and a certain device generation, seems like they work pretty well. And that seems to be true both at the hip and at the wrist when we've done
Hmm.
our analyses. The further so when you start looking at different generations, you do start to see bigger differences. So if we look at a Link versus a GT3X versus a GT3X Plus versus a GT3X, you'll start seeing slightly bigger differences. Not huge differences. And when you look at it over the course of a day, it seems to wash out
Hmm.
for the most part. And so those are typically comparable within at least a certain extent. We have seen certain, excuse me, that certain metrics are more comparable than others. So, if you just look purely at the raw data, that's one thing. But if you derive activity counts from that, or
Hmm.
if you do, some of the non-count based things like NMO, the Euclidean norm minus one, if you
Mm,
calculate that from the raw data, or the mean amplitude deviation, some of those other ways of getting a different type of metric from the raw data, those aren't necessarily affected the same way. NMO is probably the most common non-count based metric. We actually found that that metric was less comparable across devices or across device generations than counts were, or than the mean amplitude deviation was. And I'd have to get into my paper to look at some of the details for why we suspected that that might be. But it seemed to be the case that that metric was slightly less comparable across device generations.
mm,
So you can't just assume that if the raw data is good, then everything else will be good, or if counts is good, then NMO will be equivalently good, or those types of things. Yeah.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, important studies that you have been doing. And how do you see, like, you are on the researcher side? I'm wearing also the manufacturer's side hat
Yeah.
here with the podcast hat. And how do you see the collaboration? What could we do better with researchers that it would take the field forward? We would get things validated faster and so on.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, let me just say I love that idea, the idea of working together. And that's true whether we're talking about different research groups within academia, but also between industry and academia. I think working together serves to benefit everybody. So I think, transparency is one of the things, just an acknowledgement of how certain maybe metrics are derived, or certain, like these devices all collect raw data, but when you download the data, is it truly raw, or has some filtering been applied to it? It's not always clear when you're taking data from a device. When there are firmware changes, what are those
Mm,
changes, and is there any evidence that it does or does not affect the data that we're getting from the devices? And so I think some transparency from the industry, from the manufacturers, from the companies themselves, on how, if and how those things may affect data, would be an important thing. I think a two-way discussion between manufacturers and academics, or I guess the researchers in general, about what each side is hoping to get from their devices would be helpful in the validation process, right? And
mm,
so, manufacturers certainly have certain goals, and will have certain knowledge of how the devices work and what the strengths and limitations are. The researchers are your key external validators, right? And so having an understanding of what the company hopes the device can be used for will allow the researchers to better calibrate their protocols to make sure they're testing the things that the device is meant for,
mm,
versus, maybe it's intended for a certain population only. There are certain devices, or for certain activities only. And
mm,
so it would be, I shouldn't say unfair, but you wouldn't expect the device to do as well for things it's not intended for, right?
mm,
And so not to overplay some of those things in cases where very clearly the device was meant for some things, and so let's focus on those first and make sure it works for those. And then, yeah, there may be reasons to look beyond what the original intent for the device is, to see what other applications it has, but not to make those the first things that get validated or looked at with a device or a new algorithm, or some of those types of things.
mm.
So those are just a couple thoughts.
Yeah, no, good points. And I think the transparency is very important. How would you do it? The transparency, there can be a lot of small changes. There might be the battery have changed in the device,
Mm,
which should be same, but it's a different type
right.
that you cannot get any more of that, and small things here and there. So you don't
Yep.
want to make it too complicated that you always change the model number if the
Right.
change is something that you don't think it has an effect.
Yep.
But should it be some open log that is logging, and it's really accessible, or how would you do the full transparency?
Good question, right? It's easy to say we need to be more transparent, and then the details of how you do that
Hmm.
practically, and what that means is, yeah, it's a fair thing to think about. So some kind of a log that would be available, I think, would be helpful. So yeah, got batteries from a different supplier, starting on this date, firmware update on this date, and these were the intended fixes that happened with this. Did Yeah, if when there are new models, was there a new sensor that came from it? Maybe some kind of internal validation from the companies to say, every, I have no idea the time frame, but every month, let's say, we compared devices from this batch to devices from this batch using this, maybe a very, very simple protocol.
Mm,
We sat them down side by side and just made sure that, they were within 3%, or I mean, whatever,
mm,
right? You'd have to
mm,
make a set of things, but that would at least give some confidence that when you're buying different batches, or if you're
mm,
using the devices, before and after software or firmware updates, that they are in fact sampling the same way, or close enough to where we can feel confident that if you see a change in someone's activity over time, it's a true change versus just a difference in the way that the device is working,
mm,
right? So some things like that, I think would be helpful ways to help ensure that the devices are working as intended. I'll just say, I think research grade devices, or device companies that are meant for researchers, do a better job of this than the consumer wearables. I think about things like Fitbit or Apple Watch. They push through updates all the time, sometimes without notification, sometimes without any context for what those updates do. Sometimes the updates, especially on when we first started doing validations with these devices, it would have been, what, 8 years ago, they'd make
mm,
massive changes to their algorithms, and there would be no backward compatibility. You couldn't go and reinstall the previous firmware to continue to try to collect data, because they just pushed this new thing through, and now all of a sudden it's, I mean, some of the changes were massive that they would
mm,
do. There was, just to give you one example that happened to our lab, and we lost this data forever, was we were interested in, it was Fitbit, and they have a what's called an active minutes metric on their
mm,
device. So you get steps and you get calories. This active minutes metric was supposed to be minutes of time spent at an activity intensity that would contribute toward the guidelines, right? So in the
mm,
US, that's 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous activity. So this active minutes metric was supposed to help look at progress toward that. Though the government guidelines until 2018 suggested that had to happen in at least 10-minute bouts. And
mm,
so it would only count that metric if things happen for 10 minutes at a time, right?
mm,
And so we started this study, and so you're doing these activity protocols and the active minutes. You had to make sure, if you wanted to assess that, you had to make sure the activity durations were long enough to where that would get
mm,
captured. And so at one point during the study, they changed that in accordance with the updated guidelines that say any minutes are good, and any minutes that can contribute, it doesn't have to happen in bouts. And all of a sudden, our active minutes metrics just shot up, because now it's counting every minute rather than just the extended bouts. And there was no way of going back and analyzing the old data using the new firmware. And conversely, we couldn't analyze the new data with the old firmware, and so we gave up that aim of the study, because we could no longer compare across time,
mm,
right? And so that was a huge waste of effort for us on something that we could no longer use. And so it's not, again, I think the research grade companies are doing a far better job of transparency, and not making big changes often to where it substantially changes the way that the devices function. And I think the
mm,
consumer wearables, because they're pushing the field and they're trying new things, and they're more centered on what the consumers want than what the researchers need to be able to do their stuff, we have a lot more problems with those devices
mm.
overall.
Yeah, maybe word of caution for other researchers to
Yeah,
think.
yeah,
Yeah, and maybe if we talk a little bit about the past and future analysis methods for sedentary behavior and physical activity measurements, you've been doing studies about cut points, you've been doing deep learning, statistical learning methods, and also calibration of machine learning models. How do you see the field progressing? Where are we going with the analysis methods?
yeah. That's a good question. I've been all over the map in terms of both the types of validations or model development that I've done, and also kind of my view on it too. I mean, when I did my dissertation back in 2012, 2013, I was very much in the boat thinking that machine learning models were the way forward. They are, I mean, we can show in lab settings that they are more accurate. They allow for a greater variety of outcomes or metrics that we can assess with the device. They do a better job capturing some of the richness and the nuance in the data that things like cut points just don't. And so there's a lot of reasons to think that that type of approach, more advanced analytics to deal with more complex data, will give you better outcomes. I've had to eat that a little bit over the last. I mean, the field has not progressed nearly as much as I thought it would over time, in terms of most people aren't adopting those types of methods for their analysis. Certainly, more groups are now, and I think we're getting to a point where we know enough about the models, how they work, how well they work, in whom they work, those types of things. There's enough expertise now in how we can deploy these in a somewhat reasonable way so that you don't have to be an expert in coding to be able to utilize these models, or there are enough experts in coding to where you can find one and collaborate with them. I mean, that's the
Mm.
alternate approach, right? And so we are building toward those situations where it becomes easier to use these types of models. But at the end of the day, I think a couple major things I've noticed in my time with this type of analysis, and one is from the research grade field and one's from the consumer field. It seems like ease of use is probably, at least in most cases, the most important consideration that researchers use to
Mm.
decide what device they're going to use, but also to decide what analytic methods they're going to use. And what I mean by that is, if we were able to create a machine learning model that had really, really high accuracy for measuring calories, unless we make that somewhat easy for the end user to be able to use, it's not going to get used. And that's what we're seeing. And we've published a few review studies now. My group, I think we've got 3, where we just see this, so many models get developed and so few models get used by people outside of the original research group.
Mm.
And that's a problem. And because we're not, if people aren't using these models, again, it doesn't matter how good they are. They're not actually being able to be used to understand behavior and how it changes over time, or how it relates to certain health metrics, and those outcomes that we're so interested in. And so we have to make these models deployable, or accessible to people who aren't in this small group of experts who develop these, right? And
Mm.
so that's been one context. Is, I mean, we can just look at the field and say, yeah, we're developing lots of models, but if you look at what the end users are actually using, the vast majority is still steps or cut point based
Mm.
approaches, very, very simple analytic techniques to try to gain insight into physical activity and sedentary behavior. So that's the one context, or area. The other one is, you can just look at the proliferation of the consumer wearables. I mean, they're obviously for personal use. They're selling millions and millions of devices every year. But even if you look at grant applications for big epidemiologic studies or intervention type work, more and more researchers are relying on the consumer wearables, and I think at the expense of the research grade devices. And so we think, oh, why is that? They're maybe a little bit cheaper, but not substantially. Some of them capture different variables like heart rate that most of the research grade, at least the accelerometer based research grade devices, don't capture. So are they looking for the additional value that you get from something like a heart rate metric? Or is it just that these are really easy to use? They don't require really any decision making. You put in the demographics of the person and it spits out step count, calories burned, time in certain activity types, average and peak heart rate through the day, sleep quality,
Mm.
and are they just taking those metrics because they don't have to make any decisions? They don't have to figure
Mm.
out, okay, what model was validated in this population, and do I have the expertise to deploy this, and what form does the data need to be in, and all those things. It just gets cut out with the consumer wearables, and the consumer wearables spit out an outcome, and the researchers say, okay, well, that's good enough, right? and
Mm.
and so I fear that, for the sake of minimizing the burden of using these devices, people are opting for these very, very easy methods, whether it's the consumer wearables or it's simple outputs from the research grade devices. And so I think we have to acknowledge that that is the case. And so whenever we're developing our models, we have to have an eye toward usability, because otherwise they just won't get developed, or they won't get utilized. And so one paper we just got published, and I don't know if it's in press or if it's actually out and available now, but we created what we call a repository. And so this was led by Kim Clevenger out at Utah State, but she developed a website where we tried to collect every single advanced analytic model that we could find for characterizing physical activity. And then we've organized them according to population. So if you want to sample or if you want to measure physical activity in kids, here are all the models available. We organized it by device brand. So if you've got a Fibian device and you want to know, then here are the models available. Or if you have an Active Pal, here are the models available. If you that we did it by, I think, placement site. So if you're wearing a device on the hip, here are models available. So we tried to accumulate every model that's been developed for the research grade accelerometer devices and put it all in one place. And we
Mm.
update that every 3 months, so it is pretty much current in terms of what's available. And so people that are looking for, what is the best method, you can go to a single location and find it. We also are in the process of developing example data for any of those models, and for any of the models that provided code or access to the actual model for use, we have that there too. And so you can go to that place and find the model that is most appropriate given your population, the device you're using, the placement of the device, and then also it should give you everything, at least that was available to us, to help in deploying those models. And what we hope that does is improve adoption of some of these more advanced analytic approaches to analyzing data.
Mm.
So that's our goal. We have tried for years to get companies to do that. There was some momentum at NIH at one point to try to develop some kind of a repository like this. And so we're trying this, and we hope that people will be able to use this as a place to get access to the best, most recent available models.
No, that sounds really useful. Let's add the link to the show notes or in
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
episode description. That sounds
Absolutely.
very nice. And you said ease of use is usually the most important. With the machine learning models, could you just kind of have them running in a cloud that people could just upload their data in the cloud and everything would happen there and it would actually spit out the result variables? Or is there something that is more complicated that it cannot be done in certain cases?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ali. I don't think that I think that would work. I don't think that
Mm,
there. I don't think, because fundamentally, what is a machine learning model compared to a cut point approach? Well, you still need a series of inputs, and you have to calculate those somehow. But that can be done. I mean, as long as the data structure is known, and as long as we know what things we're calculating. So if you want to calculate mean, variance, the number of median crossings, maybe some
mm,
frequency, drawing a blank on the. So I'm sorry. Yeah, some time. So time domain and some frequency domain
mm,
features, right? As long as we know what those are and the calculations exist within the software, whether that's cloud based or a hard drive on your computer, the those should be able to easily be calculated. So you've got your inputs, you've got the model that's built into the cloud, let's say, and then
mm,
it spits out the outputs. And we would have to, I mean, with any of these things, you have to filter out wear time for non-wear, and some of those things. But that's true with our cut point approaches too, right? So
mm,
when you upload data to Actigraph, or when you use the R software to try to use GGIR, you do the same things. Is you have to identify non-wear time. Okay, you exclude that. You set certain wear time criteria and say days have to have at least 16 hours of valid data. If not, you exclude that. Right. So those things are common across any model you use, simple or complex. And so I don't see a fundamental difference with how the machine learning or an advanced analytic model would work. You just have to be able to put those models into a place where the data can get extracted, the necessary features can get calculated automatically, and then the outcomes can be outputted in a relatively easy format. And we've tried to get traction from device companies for which we develop analytic models. And I'm not trying to pick on Actigraph at all. I use Actigraph devices more than anything else, but Actigraph is point and click, and that's extremely attractive because you can just click on things and say, okay, I want this cut point, I want this thing, please exclude data or days with less than 10 hours of data. and then it exports things into a really easy to understand Excel format, right? So it's very
Mm,
user friendly relative to trying to code in R or Python or something like that. And so they have lots of cut points available within Actilife software. And they have a feature extraction tool now where you can calculate really a lot of the metrics that you use as inputs to machine learning models. And so we've contacted them a couple times asking, like, can you put some machine learning models in alongside the cut point approaches so that the machine learning models become point and click? Because if you
mm,
do that, people will use them, and if people use them, then we'll understand how well they work, and are they as good as we think they are, or do they blow up in certain settings or in certain
mm,
populations, and some of those things. And so, no, I don't see any fundamental difference in what it would take to put a machine learning model into a point and click format or a cloud-based format than there are for cut points. Cut points are just easier to understand, but I don't
mm,
think it's that you couldn't do something with machine learning models to automate a lot of the process.
mm. And
I'm
it's
just not a programmer, so I can't do any of it myself.
yeah, yeah.